Vallecas neighborhood, Madrid. Carlos Mendoza, owner of half the city's luxury properties, stopped in front of a peeling, time-worn building. He had come to fire the housekeeper who had dared to reject his advances. But when the door opened, it wasn't Carmen who answered. It was 3 terrified children staring at him as if he were death himself. "Please, sir, don't take mommy away," whispered the youngest, clinging to his leg with trembling little hands. Behind them, in the 2-room apartment that smelled of damp and despair, Carlos saw something that paralyzed him. Carmen, the woman who cleaned his €5,000 per square meter marble floors, was asleep on a mattress on the floor, exhausted, still in her cleaning uniform, surrounded by unpaid bills and medicines she couldn't afford. On the wall was a photo of her with a man in a Spanish Civil Guard uniform, her husband, killed in an attack in Afghanistan. The widow he had arrogantly tried to seduce. The children who were about to lose the only thing they had left, their mother. Madrid glittered under the September sun like a broken promise. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse in the Salamanca district, Carlos Mendoza contemplated the city that belonged to him, or at least the part that mattered. At 38, he had transformed his father's inheritance into a real estate empire stretching from Madrid to Barcelona, Valencia to Seville. Historic palaces turned into luxury hotels, working-class neighborhoods gentrified, lives uprooted to make space for a progress that bore his face. He was a man who measured success in square meters and people's worth by how much they could serve him. His marriage to Isabel had been a corporate merger disguised as romance. She brought the family name and connections, he brought the capital and ambition. Their divorce 2 years later had been equally calculated. She got the estate in La Moraleja. He got everything else. Carmen Lopez had entered his life 6 months before, hired through an agency to clean his penthouse 3 times a week. 32 years old, black hair pulled into a severe bun, brown eyes that never lowered before him like the other employees did. There was something about her that irritated and fascinated him in equal measure. Perhaps the way she cleaned his €100,000 floors with the same care she'd use on a church's, or the fact that she didn't seem the least bit impressed by his wealth. The attraction had grown slowly, turning into an obsession. Carlos wasn't used to wanting what he couldn't have immediately. He started with small gestures, expensive gifts left casually around, increasingly explicit compliments, dinner invitations disguised as overtime work. Carmen rejected everything with a firm courtesy that drove him mad. The night before, he had crossed the line. He'd found her on her knees cleaning the Carrara marble bathroom, and something about seeing her in that position had awakened the animal in him. He'd put a hand on her shoulder, made her stand up, pushed her against the wall. The words he'd whispered were explicit, vulgar, the kind of proposal no housekeeper in her position should refuse. But Carmen had refused. Worse, she'd looked at him with a disgust no one had dared show him in years and told him she'd rather starve than become his whore. Then she'd left, leaving him there with his excitement transformed into rage. No one rejected Carlos Mendoza. No one. He'd spent the night drinking €1,000 a bottle whiskey and planning his revenge. He wouldn't just fire her, he'd destroy her. He'd make sure no one in Madrid ever hired her again, reduce her to begging, and then, when she was desperate enough, he'd make his offer again and she'd accept, because hunger turns everyone into a pragmatist. The address from the personnel file led him to Vallecas, a neighborhood Carlos knew only as an area for redevelopment in his expansion plans. 1960s apartment blocks like scars on the urban fabric, graffiti covering peeling walls, the smell of poverty that clung to clothes. He parked his Bentley, a mistake, had he known, and climbed stairs that reeked of urine and dead dreams. Apartment 23, 4th floor. The door was a faded green that must have once been cheerful. He knocked with the force of someone used to doors opening at his command. But it wasn't Carmen who opened. 3 children stared at him with eyes too large for their thin faces. The oldest, maybe 12, held the shoulders of the younger ones protectively, a boy of 8 and a girl of 5. Their clothes were clean but mended. There was something in their gaze Carlos recognized but couldn't immediately place. Children in villages he'd had evacuated to build luxury resorts had looked at him like that. It was fear. Pure, distilled fear from those who know the adult world can destroy everything in an instant. The little girl spoke first, her voice a whisper that pierced the armor of indifference Carlos had built over years of ruthless business. Her tiny hands clung to his leg as if they could stop him, as if a child's desperation could halt an avalanche. The apartment behind them told a story Carlos didn't want to read. 2 rooms total, furniture that looked salvaged from the trash, mold in corners no amount of cleaning could erase. And there, on the floor of the living room that also served as a bedroom, Carmen slept on a thin mattress, still in her cleaning uniform, her face marked by an exhaustion that went beyond the physical. Around her, like paper sentinels, unpaid bills formed a circle of condemnation: electricity, gas, back rent. And medicines, vials and pills Carlos recognized because his mother had taken the same during chemotherapy. Expensive drugs, the kind Social Security only partly covers. But it was the photo on the wall that hit him like a punch to the gut. Carmen in a white dress, radiant, next to a man in a civil guard uniform. The same photo, smaller, was pinned above the children's makeshift beds. The father who would never return. The 8-year-old boy finally found the courage to speak, his voice trembling but determined. He told how Mom worked 3 jobs, how she never slept more than 4 hours, how she sometimes pretended not to be hungry so they could have more food. He told of Dad dying on a peacekeeping mission, the pension that wasn't enough, the sick grandmother in the hospital eating up every extra cent. Carlos stood paralyzed on the threshold, the firing speech he'd prepared dying in his throat. He looked at Carmen sleeping and for the first time truly saw her, not the housekeeper he'd wanted to possess, but a woman fighting a war he'd never had to fight, with weapons he'd never had to wield. Desperation transformed into dignity. Poverty faced with honor. Carmen woke with the feeling something was wrong. The children were too quiet, and in her life as a single mother, silence always meant trouble. When she saw Carlos Mendoza standing in her living room, surrounded by her terrified children, the blood froze in her veins. She stood up with a dignity she didn't know she still possessed, smoothing her wrinkled uniform, bracing for the storm. She knew why he was there. She knew what it meant for her family. But she wouldn't apologize for defending her honor. Some things were worth more than bread. Carlos watched her rise. He saw how she positioned herself between him and the children like a lioness ready to die for her cubs, and something broke inside him. Not his heart, he wasn't sure he had one yet, but something deeper, older. Perhaps the conscience he'd buried under years of ruthless success. The words that left his mouth weren't the ones he'd prepared. He found himself asking about the children, the husband, the life she led. Carmen answered with suspicion, but when he sat on the sunken couch and set aside his boss's arrogance, something shifted in the air. The story came out in pieces between the children's interruptions, adding details Carmen would have preferred to keep hidden. Miguel, her husband, dead 3 years prior in Afghanistan, not in combat, but saving a school from an attack. A hero without medals, because medals don't pay rent. The pitiful pension, the multiple jobs, the mother-in-law sick with cancer requiring expensive care. And then the most painful truth: Carmen had 2 degrees, in architecture and civil engineering, earned studying at night while Miguel was on duty. Dreams of building houses for those who couldn't afford them, turned into the reality of cleaning houses for those who had too many. Carlos listened, and every word was a nail in a coffin. He looked at the children, Lucia, Diego, little Maria, and saw in them their mother's same fire, the same stubborn dignity that refused to bend even when the world did its best to break them. When Carmen finished speaking, the silence in the apartment was thick as fog. Carlos stood up, and everyone tensed, expecting the sentence. Instead, he did something he hadn't done since his father died. He knelt. He knelt before Carmen and asked for forgiveness. Not just for the unwanted advances, but for having been the kind of man who believed everything had a price. He told her he hadn't come just to fire her, but to offer something different. Not charity, not pity, but an opportunity. Carlos's office occupied an entire floor of the Mendoza Tower on the Paseo de la Castellana. Carmen arrived there the next morning, dressed in the only suit she owned, from Miguel's funeral. The children were at school, unaware their lives were about to change in ways even she couldn't foresee. Carlos was waiting, but not behind the monumental desk. He stood by the windows, looking down at Madrid from the heights. When he turned, Carmen saw a different man from the one she'd known. The gray eyes were no longer predatory, but thoughtful. The smile, no longer arrogant, but uncertain. The proposal he made left her breathless. He didn't want her to clean his houses anymore. He wanted her to design them. He'd seen her degrees. He'd done research overnight. He'd discovered the projects she'd submitted in university, visionary and practical at the same time. Sustainable, beautiful, affordable social housing, exactly what Madrid needed and no one wanted to build because it wasn't profitable enough. He wanted to create a division of Mendoza Construcciones dedicated to quality social housing, not charity, but sustainable business, and he wanted Carmen to lead it. The salary he proposed was 20 times what she earned as a housekeeper, full benefits, health insurance for the whole family, funds for the children's education, a company apartment in a better area near good schools. Carmen looked at him as if he were crazy. She looked for the trick, the trap, the hidden price. But Carlos laid the contracts on the table, all in order, no hidden clauses. The only condition was that she start immediately. She'd already lost too much time. Carmen's first instinct was to refuse. Pride spoke louder than need. But then she thought of her children. Her sick mother-in-law. The dreams she'd buried with Miguel. And she thought of all the families like hers, living in unworthy homes because no one believed the poor deserved beauty. She accepted, but with her own conditions. Total transparency in the projects, no compromise on quality, and a promise that the housing would go first to those who truly needed it, not those who could pay the most. Carlos agreed to everything. And when they shook hands to seal the deal, they both felt it wasn't just a job contract. It was the beginning of a revolution. The first months were hell. Madrid's construction world wasn't ready for Carmen Lopez. A woman, a widow, a former housekeeper who dared to sit at the tables where the city's urban destiny was decided. Carlos's partners were scandalized. Competitors laughed. The media painted her as the mistress who'd seduced the millionaire to gain power. But Carmen had endured worse. She'd buried a husband, raised 3 children alone, survived poverty. The old dinosaurs of construction didn't scare her. She faced them with impeccable technical skill, innovative proposals, and a determination that turned every obstacle into an opportunity. The first project was in the Carabanchel neighborhood, 100 units of protected housing that looked like they were from an architecture magazine, not a bureaucratic nightmare. Sustainable yet economical materials, designs that maximized light and space, communal gardens that created community instead of ghettos. The cost per unit was half the estimate, the quality double the standard. Carlos watched her work with an admiration that grew each day. The woman he'd wanted to possess had become someone who inspired him to be better. He began to see his projects not as numbers on a spreadsheet, but as lives to improve. For the first time in years, he slept without whiskey. He woke with a purpose that went beyond profit. Carmen's children started attending better schools but kept the humility their mother had taught them. Diego excelled in math. Lucia showed artistic talent. Little Maria won everyone over with her contagious joy. They often came to the office after school, transforming the austere Mendoza Tower into something more human with their laughter and drawings hung everywhere. It was Maria, with the innocence of her 6 years, who said what everyone saw but no one dared name. One afternoon, while Carlos was showing her how to use the computer, she asked, "Mr. Carlos, when are you going to marry Mommy?" The silence that followed was electric. Carmen blushed. Carlos coughed, embarrassed. But the girl continued, unfazed. "Because you look at her like Daddy looked at her in the pictures. And she smiles like she hasn't smiled since Daddy went to heaven." The truth spoken by a child changed everything and nothing. Carlos and Carmen continued working together, but now there was an awareness in the air, a tension that was no longer just professional. They found themselves working late, alone in the office, discussing projects but really talking about dreams, fears, regrets. Carlos spoke of the tyrannical father who'd taught him love was weakness, of the mother who died when he was 10, leaving him alone with a man who measured affection in inheritances. Carmen spoke of Miguel, of the love they'd shared, of the fear of betraying his memory by loving again. The turning point came during the inauguration of the Carabanchel project. 200 families receiving keys to dignified homes, children running in safe gardens, elderly people crying with joy over windows that actually closed and heating that always worked. Carmen was giving the inauguration speech when her voice broke upon seeing a family identical to what hers had been. A single mother, 3 children, eyes that knew hunger. Carlos stepped onto the stage, took her hand in front of everyone, and finished the speech for her. He spoke of how Carmen Lopez had taught him that true success isn't measured in profits, but in changed lives. How a woman who had every reason to hate the world had chosen, instead, to make it better. How he, Carlos Mendoza, Madrid's real estate shark, had fallen in love not just with a woman, but with a vision of a world where dignity was priceless. The public declaration shook Madrid. The media went wild. Partners threatened revolt. Isabel reappeared out of nowhere, claiming rights she didn't have. But in the chaos, Carmen and Carlos found a peace neither had ever known. It wasn't the overwhelming love Carmen had shared with Miguel. It was something different, more mature, built on mutual respect and shared purpose. The children accepted Carlos gradually, not as a replacement for their father, that place was sacred, but as a new presence in their lives. Diego found in him a mentor for math and business. Lucia found someone who funded her art courses without question. Maria simply found another adult to love with the enthusiasm of one who hasn't yet learned to guard her heart. Carmen's mother-in-law, Esperanza, was the last to yield. When Carlos quietly paid for the experimental treatments that gave her 2 more years of life, when she saw him hold Carmen's hand during nights at the hospital, when she heard him promise Miguel at his grave that he would protect the family, then, and only then, did she give her blessing. 2 years after that first visit to Vallecas, Madrid had changed. Mendoza Construcciones had become a leader in sustainable social housing, copied but never equaled. Carmen had been named Architect of the Year, the first time the award went to social projects instead of luxury skyscrapers. Carlos had discovered you could be both rich and humane, that profit didn't have to mean exploitation. The wedding was simple, in the rebuilt church of the Carabanchel neighborhood. There were no celebrities or politicians, just the families living in the homes Carmen had designed, the children playing in the gardens she'd dreamed of, the elderly blessing her for restoring their dignity. Carmen wore a simple dress, not white, that color belonged to Miguel, but blue like the Madrid sky on a rare clear day. Her children walked her down the aisle not to give her away, but to welcome Carlos into their family. Maria carried the rings. Diego read a letter he'd written to his father in heaven, explaining why it was okay for Mom to love again. Lucia sang a song she'd composed about the family you choose. Isabel appeared at the reception, uninvited but not turned away. She approached Carmen with the arrogance of one used to always winning, but what she said surprised everyone. You've made him into the man I could never see. Perhaps because you looked beyond the bank account. Treat him well. Under all that hardness, he's as fragile as glass. The real surprise came from Vallecas. Carmen's old neighbors, who'd watched her struggle every day, had organized a collection. Not money, they knew she didn't need it anymore, but something more valuable. They'd gathered stories, memories from everyone Carmen had helped when she had nothing to give except kindness. Mrs. Paquita, whose groceries she carried after she broke her hip. Little Ahmed, whom she tutored for free. The Roma family, to whom she gave her children's outgrown clothes. Stories of a wealth Carlos never knew existed. Epilogue. 5 years later. Carmen's office in the Mendoza Tower was unrecognizable. Where there had been cold marble, now there were drawings from neighborhood children, models of future projects, photos of families in their new homes. The monumental desk had been replaced by a work table, always covered in blueprints, pencils, and cold coffee cups. Carlos entered carrying their 2-year-old daughter, Esperanza, named for the grandmother she never met, but whose stories lived on in the family. The girl had her father's gray eyes and her mother's determination, a combination that promised future trouble. The kids had grown. Diego, now 17, was an intern at the company but with his own ideas on combining profit and purpose. Lucia, 14, painted murals on the social housing projects, turning gray walls into explosions of color and hope. Maria, 10, had inherited her mother's ability to see beyond appearances and her father's ability to get what he wanted, a dangerous combination in a preteen. Carmen was presenting the new project to the board, an entire sustainable neighborhood in Extremadura, where poverty was even harsher than in Madrid. The numbers said it was feasible, even profitable, but above all, necessary. As she spoke, Carlos looked at her and saw not the housekeeper he'd tried to seduce, not the architect who'd revolutionized social housing, but the woman who'd taught him that true wealth isn't counted in euros, but in lives touched, in dignity restored, in hope planted like seeds in soil everyone else had written off as barren. That night, heading home, not to the sterile penthouse in Salamanca, but to a real house in Carabanchel, in the neighborhood they'd rebuilt together. They passed the old building in Vallecas. It had been renovated as part of the renewal program Carmen directed, but apartment 23 had been preserved as it was, turned into a small museum of resilience. A plaque on the door read, "Here lived Carmen Lopez Mendoza, who transformed desperation into determination and taught Madrid that every family deserves a home, not just a roof." But for Carlos, the real lesson was another. That faded green door had taught him that sometimes you have to descend into hell to understand what paradise truly is. That wealth without purpose is gilded poverty. And that love, real love, isn't bought or taken. It's earned, day by day, brick by brick, like the houses Carmen built for those who'd never dared to dream of owning one. Little Esperanza pointed at the door and said her first full sentence, "Mommy's house." And in a sense, she was right. That wasn't just the house where Carmen had lived. It was the house where Carlos had learned to truly live. The circle had closed. The millionaire who'd gone to the housekeeper's home to destroy her had found, instead, his salvation. And the housekeeper, who'd feared losing everything, had gained not just financial security, but the chance to change the world, one neighborhood at a time. Madrid glowed in the dusk, unaware that its transformation had begun in a 2-room apartment in Vallecas, where a woman had chosen dignity over survival and a man had chosen humanity over profit. Sometimes revolutions start like this, not with proclamations or violence, but with the simple act of truly seeing another human being and deciding they deserve more. So much more.